The Telltale Heart is one of Edgar Allan Poe's most famous short stories. It is a classic of Gothic horror, notable for its psychological depth and exploration of guilt and madness. The story is narrated by an unnamed protagonist who insists on his sanity while describing the events that led him to commit a murder. The story opens with the narrator's fervent declaration of his sanity. From the outset, the narrator is determined to convince the reader that his heightened senses and nervousness are not symptoms of madness, but rather signs of a sharp mind. The narrator's obsession is introduced almost immediately, an intense fixation on the old man's eye. The eye is described in grotesque detail as resembling that of a vulture pale blue with a film over it. The narrator claims that this eye alone provoked him to commit murder. Despite harboring no ill will towards the old man himself, the narrator recounts how this obsession with the eye took hold of him, overshadowing all other thoughts. He emphasizes that it was not the old man who vexed him, but his evil eye. The mere sight of it chilled his blood, and it was this irrational aversion that compelled him to contemplate murder. This fixation on the eye, as opposed to any other feature or action of the old man, sets the stage for the psychological unraveling that follows. The narrator describes his meticulous planning over the course of a week. Every night, at precisely midnight, he crept into the old man's room with the utmost stealth. He detailed the precision with which he executed this nightly ritual, each night pushing the door open slowly and carefully, ensuring it did not creak, and then inserting a dark lantern into the room. The narrator highlights his cunning and foresight, believing these to be evidence of his sanity. The lantern is described as having a single, thin ray of light, which the narrator aimed directly at the old man's eye. However, each night, the eye was closed, thwarting the narrator's intentions. Despite this, the narrator took pride in his patience and cunning, convinced that his careful planning and nightly vigilance demonstrated his mental acuity rather than his madness. On the 8th night, the narrator's actions take a decisive turn. This night, the narrator is more cautious and more triumphant in his stealth, feeling the creeping of the hour and the careful slowness of his movements more keenly than before. However, this night is different. The old man wakes up. The narrator recounts feeling a surge of power and excitement as he opens the lantern slightly, causing the old man to sit up in bed and listen in the dark. The narrator stays perfectly still for a long time, reveling in the suspense and his own cunning. After some time, the narrator slowly opens the lantern just enough to let a single thin ray fall upon the old man's vulture eye, which is now wide open. The sight of the eye drives the narrator to madness. The intensity of his obsession is such that he perceives the eye as a separate entity, almost as if it possesses a malevolent life of its own. It is at this point that the narrator's grip on reality begins to slip, as he describes hearing the old man's heart beating, a sound he believes grows louder and louder. Driven to the brink by the sight of the open eye and the imagined sound of the old man's heart, the narrator acts. He leaps into the room, pulls the old man from his bed, and smothers him with the heavy bedclothes. The old man's struggles are brief, but desperate, and soon he is still. The narrator, in a moment of triumph, smiles, believing he has silenced both the old man and the accursed eye forever. The narrator's recounting of the murder is marked by a chilling detachment. He describes the act of smothering the old man with a disturbing calmness, as though it were a simple, necessary task. The narrator's obsession with the eye and his subsequent actions are portrayed as methodical and calculated, further emphasizing the psychological horror of the story. After the old man is dead, the narrator goes to great lengths to conceal the crime. He describes the process of dismembering the body with a precision that borders on the obsessive. The narrator cuts off the old man's head, arms, and legs, taking care to ensure there is no blood, as he performed the dismemberment in a tub. This level of detail serves to underline the narrator's deranged state of mind. The narrator then carefully hides the pieces of the body beneath the floorboard of the old man's room. He takes pride in the cleanliness and thoroughness of his work, convinced that there is no way the crime could be discovered. The narrator's meticulousness and the satisfaction he derives from it are eerily juxtaposed with the gruesome nature of his actions. Just as the narrator finishes concealing the body, there is a knock at the door. It is now 4 o'clock in the morning, and the narrator feels a sense of calm and confidence. Opening the door, he finds 3 police officers. A neighbor had heard a scream during the night and alerted the authorities, fearing foul play. The narrator remains unfazed, inviting the officers inside with a smile and a sense of assurance that his perfect crime will not be uncovered. The narrator explains to the officers that the scream was his own, caused by a nightmare, and that the old man is away in the country. He leads the officers through the house, inviting them to search it thoroughly. The narrator's composure is unshaken, and he even brings chairs into the old man's room for the officers to sit and rest. The narrator places his own chair directly above the hidden remains of the old man, confident that he has left no evidence behind. As the police sit and chat, the narrator begins to hear a faint, rhythmic noise. At first, he dismisses it as a product of his heightened senses, but soon the noise grows louder and more insistent. The narrator realizes it is the beating of a heart, and he is convinced it is the old man's heart still beating beneath the floorboards. The sound grows unbearable, thundering in the narrator's ears, as loud and persistent as a drum. The narrator's calm facade begins to crack. He starts to sweat and fidget, his mind racing with the terror of being discovered. Despite his best efforts to remain composed, the incessant beating drives him to the brink of insanity. He becomes increasingly agitated, his conversation with the officers growing erratic and strained. The narrator's guilt and paranoia reach a fever pitch. He becomes convinced that the officers can also hear the sound and are mocking him with their calm demeanor and polite conversation. The narrator's internal torment becomes unbearable, and he is driven to the edge by the relentless beating, which he perceives as an accusation of his guilt. In a final, frantic outburst, the narrator can no longer contain his guilt and paranoia. He leaps up, screaming his confession to the crime, and begs the officers to tear up the floorboards to reveal the old man's dismembered body. The story ends with the narrator's breakdown, his guilt laid bare for all to see, as he declares that the beating heart drove him to madness and confession.